Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into one of the strangest and darkest moments in human history. A time when an ordinary morning could slowly turn into the beginning of something terrifying. You wake up in a small medieval town somewhere in Europe. The year is the late 1340s, and at first everything feels completely normal. Roosters crow somewhere behind wooden cottages. Smoke drifts lazily from chimneys, and the smell of fresh bread sneaks out from the baker's shop down the narrow street. It feels like the kind of peaceful morning that makes you think the day will be simple. Unfortunately, you probably wouldn't last very long here, not because you're weak or anything, but because in this world, people have absolutely no idea that one of the deadliest disasters in human history is quietly approaching their door. So before we wander too far into tonight's story, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening while drifting off to sleep somewhere around the world, feel free to leave a comment with your location and the local time where you are. It's always fascinating seeing where everyone is tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step outside your small wooden house, pulling your cloak a little tighter against the cool morning air. The streets are already busy. A farmer pushes a cart filled with vegetables toward the marketplace. Chickens wander freely between muddy footprints in the road. A blacksmith is already hammering away at a glowing piece of metal, the steady clang echoing through the town. Life here is noisy, messy, and surprisingly crowded. Medieval towns were not exactly known for cleanliness. Waste often ends up tossed directly into the streets. Animals roam wherever they want, and rainwater mixes everything together into a thick, muddy soup that coats your boots. Historians know that sanitation during the Middle Ages was extremely poor by modern standards. Most towns had no sewer systems, and garbage piles often sat just outside city walls. To the people living here, though, it's simply normal life. But today, there's something different floating through the air. Not a smell, a rumor. You first hear it near the well in the town square, where a few villagers are already gathered with wooden buckets. Someone is whispering about a sickness spreading across distant lands. At first, it sounds like the kind of story travelers bring back from long journeys, half truth, half exaggeration. Someone says the disease came from far to the east. Someone else claims entire cities are dying. Another person insists it's just another fever, nothing unusual. And honestly, rumors like this pop up all the time in the medieval world. News travels slowly, often carried by merchants or sailors who might have crossed hundreds of miles. By the time a story reaches your town, it's usually been stretched, twisted, and embroidered with a dozen dramatic details. So most people shrug it off, but the merchant telling the story looks uneasy. He says ships have arrived at ports along the Mediterranean filled with sick sailors. Some ships drifted into harbor with barely anyone alive on board. The few survivors were burning with fever and covered in strange swellings. Historians today know this moment marks the arrival of the Black Death, one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. Between 1347 and 1351, it would kill an estimated one-third of Europe's population. But standing here in the town square, you have absolutely no idea what's coming. To you, the world still feels stable. Church bells ring calmly in the distance. Children run past laughing. Dogs bark at passing carts. The town looks alive. Yet somewhere far away, the disease is already moving silently along trade routes, carried by ships, wagons, and caravans that connect cities across continents. The strange thing is that the real culprits are incredibly small. Tiny fleas, and very ordinary rats. Now, you might expect people in the Middle Ages to notice something strange about rats spreading sickness. After all, rats are everywhere. They scurry through alleyways, hide in barns, sneak into grain stores, and crawl inside the walls of houses. But here's the tricky part. Rats had lived alongside humans for centuries. People were used to them. They were just another unpleasant part of daily life. No one suspected that fleas feeding on infected rats could carry a deadly bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Historians and scientists only discovered this centuries later with modern microbiology. Back in your town, though, none of that knowledge exists. Instead, people explain disease in very different ways. Some believe illness is caused by bad air, something they call miasma. If the air smells foul, they assume it might carry sickness. Others think disease is punishment from God, and some simply believe illness appears randomly, like storms rolling in without warning. So when the merchant finishes telling his story, the crowd reacts the way people often do when faced with frightening news. They laugh it off. One old man mutters that travelers exaggerate everything. Another woman says sickness always comes and goes. Someone even jokes that the rumor probably started because sailors drank too much wine. For now, life continues exactly as it always has. You head toward the marketplace where vendors are setting up their stalls. Fish are laid out on wooden tables. Bundles of herbs hang from ropes. A butcher sharpens his knife while chatting casually with customers. Everything feels ordinary, but historians still argue about exactly how quickly people first realized something was terribly wrong. Some records suggest entire towns remained unaware of the danger until the disease was already inside their walls. And that might be exactly what's happening here, because while people talk and trade and go about their routines, a merchant wagon quietly enters the town gate. The driver looks tired after a long journey. The cart behind him carries sacks of grain and cloth from distant cities. Hidden deep within that cargo, tiny fleas cling to the fur of a few stowaway rats. They've traveled hundreds of miles without anyone noticing. The rats jump down into the streets the moment the wagon stops. They disappear into shadows, into cellars, into barns, into walls. No one pays them any attention. After all, they're just rats. And as the sun climbs higher in the sky and the town continues its ordinary day, something invisible has already begun. Not with thunder, not with alarms, but quietly, almost politely, slipping into the life of the town like an uninvited guest who hasn't yet been noticed. For now, the bells still ring normally. The markets still buzz with noise. But very soon, those bells will start ringing for a very different reason. And when that moment comes, the peaceful morning you just walked through will feel like the calm before a storm. No one here is prepared to survive. The next morning begins almost exactly the same way as the one before. The sun rises slowly over the rooftops, painting the wooden beams of houses with warm gold light. Roosters crow again. Bakers pull steaming loaves from their ovens. Somewhere down the street, a cartwheel squeaks loudly as a farmer heads toward the market. If you didn't know any better, you'd think nothing had changed. But something has. You notice it first in the voices around you. People are speaking a little more quietly today. The rumor from yesterday didn't completely disappear overnight. In fact, it seems to have grown a little stronger, like a whisper that keeps echoing through the town. Near the well, a woman tells another villager that a traveler collapsed at an inn outside the city walls. Someone else claims a sailor from the southern ports arrived already sick. Most people still treat the story with skepticism, but now there's a faint edge of curiosity, maybe even unease. Historians believe the Black Death likely reached Europe through Mediterranean trading ports in 1347, especially cities connected to long-distance trade routes. Merchant ships carried goods like silk, spices, and grain across vast distances. Unfortunately, they also carried rats, and those rats carried fleas. But in your town, none of that science exists yet. People rely on observation and superstition instead. So when the first truly strange thing happens, it doesn't immediately connect to the rumors. You're walking through the marketplace when you notice a small crowd forming outside a house near the edge of the square. At first it looks like nothing serious. Crowds gather for all sorts of reasons, arguments, announcements, or sometimes just plain curiosity. But this crowd is unusually quiet. A woman standing nearby whispers that the baker's apprentice inside the house fell ill during the night. At first they thought it was just a fever, something common enough in medieval life. Illness happens frequently when people live close together in crowded conditions. But this fever is different. The boy, they say, woke up sweating heavily, his skin burning hot. Then he started complaining about intense pain in his body, especially under his arms and around his neck. By morning, strange swellings appeared beneath his skin. Painful ones. People inside the house described them as dark lumps, growing larger by the hour. Today we know these swellings as buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that gave the bubonic plague its name. They could appear in the groin, armpits, or neck, sometimes growing as large as eggs. But standing here in the street, the people around you have never seen anything quite like it. One man suggests the boy must have eaten spoiled food. Another says it's probably just a bad infection. A third person mutters something about curses. And this is where things become unsettling. Because while the town debates what might be happening, the illness inside that house is moving incredibly fast. Within hours, the baker's apprentice grows weaker. His fever climbs higher. The swellings darken. Some accounts from medieval chroniclers describe victims becoming dizzy, confused, or barely able to stand. One Italian writer from the time even recorded that people could appear healthy in the morning and be dead by evening. Historians still argue whether those descriptions were exaggerated, but one thing is certain: the disease could move with terrifying speed. By midday, the boy's family sends someone to fetch a local healer. Medical knowledge in medieval Europe is complicated. Some doctors study ancient Greek texts written by physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, whose theories about balancing bodily fluids, called humors, still influence medicine at this time. According to these ideas, sickness happens when the body's four humors fall out of balance: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. To fix the imbalance, doctors might recommend diet changes, herbs, or even bloodletting. Whether any of that actually helps is another question entirely. The healer arrives carrying a leather bag filled with tools and dried plants. He looks concerned but calm. Fevers aren't unusual in this world. People survive many illnesses, but when he examines the apprentice, his expression changes. No one in the crowd outside sees exactly what happens inside the house, but word spreads quickly. The swellings are worse than expected, much worse, and by the late afternoon, the church bell rings once. Not the cheerful ringing that calls people to prayer, but the slow, heavy toll that signals a death. The baker's apprentice is gone. The news spreads through town faster than any official announcement could. Markets suddenly feel quieter. Conversations stop halfway through sentences. It's only one death. In a medieval town, death isn't uncommon. Life expectancy is shorter than today, and diseases frequently pass through communities. But something about this death feels different. The speed, the strange symptoms, and the rumor from yesterday suddenly feels a little less like a story. Still, most people convince themselves not to worry too much. Humans have always been very good at believing disasters happen somewhere else. Not here, not today. As evening settles over the town, candles flicker in windows, and people gather around dinner tables. Families eat bread and stew, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping through their thoughts. But in the dark corners of barns and cellars, something else is happening. The rats that arrived with that merchant wagon are busy exploring their new home. They squeeze through cracks in wooden walls, climb across sacks of grain, and scurry along beams overhead. And the fleas riding on their fur are hungry. Here's a strange detail historians discovered much later. When fleas infected with plague bacteria feed on blood, the bacteria can clog their digestive system. This blockage makes the flea constantly hungry, causing it to bite again and again. Each bite passes the bacteria into a new host, sometimes a rat, sometimes a human, and the flea doesn't care which one it finds. So while the town slowly settles into sleep, completely unaware of what has begun, the first invisible steps of the plague continue quietly in the shadows. Tomorrow, another person might feel a sudden fever, then another, and another. For now, though, the town rests peacefully under the stars, unaware that the mysterious sickness whispered about in distant lands has already taken its first life here. And unfortunately, it won't be the last. The morning after the baker's apprentice dies, the town feels slightly different. Not dramatically different. No alarms ringing, no soldiers at the gates, but the atmosphere has shifted in a subtle way. People speak a little more quietly. When neighbors pass each other on the street, Their conversations pause for a moment before continuing. It's the kind of quiet tension that spreads through a place when something unsettling has happened, but no one fully understands it yet. You head toward the marketplace again, following the same muddy streets you walked yesterday. The butcher is still at his stall. The baker's shop, however, remains closed today. That alone is unusual. Bread is the center of daily life in medieval Europe. Most people eat it at nearly every meal, and bakers rarely close their shops unless something serious has happened. A small wooden sign hangs crookedly on the bakery door. Someone has scratched a simple message into the wood, closed for mourning. People passing by glance at it quickly and keep moving. No one wants to linger. The church bell rang again during the night. You heard someone say earlier this morning. Not for the apprentice this time. He was buried yesterday evening, but for another villager, an older man who lived near the outer wall of the town. He had also fallen ill suddenly. Fever, pain, strange swellings. By sunrise he was gone too. 2 deaths in 2 days. Now the rumor that drifted through town earlier doesn't feel quite so distant anymore. Historians today know that when the Black Death arrived in a community, it often began quietly like this. A few scattered deaths, symptoms people had never quite seen before. At first, it didn't look like a catastrophe, but beneath that slow beginning, something far more dangerous was already happening, because the real engines of the plague are still moving through the town unnoticed. Rats, you see them everywhere if you start paying attention. They dart across alleyways between houses. They hide under market stalls, nibbling spilled grain. Sometimes they squeeze through the wooden beams of barns or crawl across the rafters of storage sheds. Most townspeople don't even react when a rat runs past their feet. Rats are simply part of life here. Where there is food, there will always be rodents. And medieval towns are absolutely full of food. Grain sacks, vegetable carts, meat scraps tossed into the street. It's basically a paradise for rats. What no one can see are the tiny passengers riding along with them. Fleas. These fleas are carrying a bacterium that modern scientists call Yersinia pestis, the microorganism responsible for plague. But in the 1300s, of course, nobody has microscopes. The entire invisible world of bacteria and germs is still centuries away from discovery. So the connection between rats, fleas, and disease remains completely hidden. Here's the strange part historians have uncovered. During plague outbreaks, rats often begin dying before humans do. At first, that might not sound very dramatic. Rats die all the time. They fight each other, get trapped, or simply fail to find enough food. But in towns hit by the plague, something unusual sometimes happens. Large numbers of rats start dying suddenly. And when those rats die, the fleas living on them need new hosts. Often those new hosts are humans. You're walking past a row of storage sheds when you notice a boy poking something with a stick. A couple of other children stand nearby watching. Curious, you step closer. On the ground lies a rat. It's completely still. The boy nudges it again with the stick, then shrugs. Dead, he says. No one seems especially surprised. Rats die all the time, after all. But if someone from the future were standing here beside you, they might feel a chill run down their spine, because clusters of dead rats can sometimes appear shortly before a plague outbreak explodes. Historians still debate how often medieval people noticed this pattern. Some records suggest they did see unusual numbers of dead rats. Others argue that chroniclers rarely mention them at all. Either way, the people of your town are not connecting the dots. The dead rat gets tossed into a nearby ditch. Life goes on. Meanwhile, another quiet detail begins to unfold inside several houses across town. More fevers. A woman near the market wakes up feeling strangely weak. She assumes she simply worked too hard the previous day. A stable hand complains about aching joints and dizziness. A merchant's daughter says she feels unusually hot and tired. None of them yet realize they may be experiencing the earliest stages of something far worse. Because one of the most frightening things about plague is how quickly it can move once infection begins spreading. Within a few days, what started as isolated illnesses can suddenly multiply. One house, then another, then another. Medieval towns are perfect environments for this kind of spread. Families live close together in small wooden buildings. Streets are narrow and crowded. People share wells, markets, churches, and communal ovens. There is constant contact, constant movement, constant opportunity for fleas to jump from one host to another. And there's another strange historical detail that still puzzles researchers today. Some survivors of the Black Death reported smelling unusual odors in the air before outbreaks intensified. Certain chroniclers described a corrupted atmosphere drifting through cities. This ties back to the medieval belief in miasma, the theory that bad smells cause disease. Modern historians believe these descriptions were probably misunderstandings of other environmental factors, rotting waste, polluted air, or simply fear shaping how people interpreted their surroundings. But in your town, those beliefs are taken seriously. By late afternoon, someone in the marketplace claims the air smells strange today. Another person insists the wind has changed direction. Someone else says the sickness must be spreading through foul vapors. Whether that's true or not, fear begins creeping quietly through conversations. You notice people stepping slightly farther away from strangers when they talk. A few families decide to stay home from the evening market. Even the tavern feels less crowded tonight. Still, most people are trying very hard to believe everything will return to normal soon. Maybe the illness will pass. Maybe it was just a few unlucky cases. After all, epidemics have come and gone before. But as the sun sets once again over the rooftops, the town is unknowingly sitting at the very edge of something enormous. The rats continue moving through barns and walls. The fleas continue feeding. And somewhere tonight, another villager will likely wake up sweating, confused, and burning with fever. By the time the town truly understands what has arrived, the sickness will already be everywhere. By the time another morning rolls in, the town no longer feels quite as calm as it did a few days ago. The streets are still busy, carts still rumble over uneven stones, and the smell of bread still drifts through the air. But there's a tension now, something people can't quite explain. 3 more villagers fell ill during the night. Word spreads the way news always spreads in a medieval town, through whispers, kitchen conversations, and hurried talks near the well. No official announcement is needed. Everyone simply knows. You pass 2 women talking quietly outside a doorway. They lower their voices when you walk by. Inside another house, someone is coughing loudly behind a wooden shutter. Across the street, a family has closed their windows even though the air outside is cool and pleasant. Fear doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in slowly, and now people are starting to realize something unusual is happening. By midday, someone rides into town on horseback carrying a message from a nearby city. The rider looks exhausted, dust covering his cloak and boots. He brings unsettling news. The sickness isn't just here. It's everywhere. Entire towns to the south are reporting the same strange illness. Fevers, swelling lumps, sudden deaths. Some places have already begun losing dozens of people each week. Historians know that by the late 1340s, the Black Death was racing across Europe at a terrifying speed, traveling along trade routes that connected port cities, market towns, and villages. In some regions, entire communities would see half their population vanish within months. But standing here in your small town, those numbers still feel distant. Right now, people are focused on a much simpler question. Can anyone stop this? That's when the first doctor arrives. Well, doctor might not mean what you expect. The man who rides through the town gate looks unusual, even by medieval standards. He wears a long, dark coat made of heavy fabric, thick gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat. But the strangest thing about him is his mask. It stretches forward into a long, curved beak. For a moment, you might think it looks almost like the head of a giant bird. People step aside as he walks down the street toward the home of the latest patient. Some villagers stare openly, others whisper. The outfit is meant to protect him from disease. Inside the beak of the mask, there are small pouches filled with dried herbs, things like lavender, mint, rose petals, and cloves. Medieval doctors believed these pleasant smells could filter dangerous air and protect them from illness. This idea connects again to the miasma theory. the belief that sickness spreads through foul odors or poisoned air. If the bad smells could be blocked, maybe the disease could be avoided. Of course, modern medicine knows this approach doesn't actually stop plague bacteria. Fleas can still bite through clothing, and bacteria don't simply float around in smells. But at the time, the costume made perfect sense. And honestly, it must have looked terrifying. Imagine being a frightened villager already worried about a mysterious illness, and then seeing someone walk toward you dressed like a tall, silent bird with dark glass eyes. Even today, the image of the plague doctor has become one of the most recognizable symbols of the Black Death. Historians still debate how common these outfits really were. Some records suggest they appeared mainly in larger cities during later outbreaks, not necessarily in every small town. But whether common or rare, the strange costume certainly left a lasting impression. The doctor disappears inside the sick man's house. Outside, villagers gather in small groups waiting for news. Everyone is hoping he might have some kind of cure or remedy. Inside the house, the examination begins. The patient lies on a simple bed, sweating heavily, breathing fast. His skin feels burning hot, and beneath his arm, one of those dark swellings has appeared again. Painful, swollen. The doctor presses gently on it while the man groans. There aren't many treatments available in medieval medicine, but doctors still try a variety of methods. Some believe the swelling contains corrupted humors that need to be released from the body. That leads to one particularly uncomfortable procedure: lancing the bubo. Using a small blade, the doctor cuts open the swollen lump in an attempt to drain the infection. It's painful, messy, and often ineffective. Sometimes herbs or ointments are applied afterward. Sometimes heated cups are placed on the skin to draw out poison. Sometimes patients are simply told to rest and pray. And here's one of the strange historical facts scholars still discuss. Some plague treatments involved sitting near strong smells like burning wood, incense, or even certain animals. One medieval recommendation suggested that sitting near a fire with aromatic herbs could protect you from disease. Another bizarre remedy involved carrying flowers or spices close to the nose. It's actually where the nursery rhyme, "Ring around the rosy," is sometimes loosely connected to plague history, though historians still argue about whether that connection is real or a later myth. Back outside the house, the crowd waits anxiously. The doctor eventually steps back into the street, removing one glove slowly. His face is hidden behind the mask, but his body language says enough. He shakes his head. There's no cure. The crowd grows quieter. Some people cross themselves. Others walk away quickly, as if distance alone might keep them safe. And that quiet fear spreading through the town begins to grow a little stronger. Because if the doctor doesn't know how to stop the sickness, then no one does. That night the church bell rings again. And again, and again. Each slow toll echoes across rooftops and empty streets, drifting through the cool night air. By morning, the town will wake up knowing something has truly changed. The illness isn't just a rumor anymore. It's here, and it's beginning to spread. By the time another morning arrives, the town no longer feels like the same place you walked through just a few days ago. The changes aren't dramatic at first glance. The buildings still stand where they always have. The narrow streets still wind between houses and shops. Smoke still curls lazily from a few chimneys. But something in the rhythm of daily life has shifted. The marketplace, which once buzzed with loud bargaining and laughter, now sounds strangely muted. A few stalls remain open, but many are empty. Wooden tables that once displayed fish, vegetables, and bread now sit bare under the morning sun. People move quickly through the square, finishing their errands and heading home. No one lingers. You notice it especially in the way neighbors look at each other. Conversations end sooner than usual. Friends stand a little farther apart when they talk. A man coughing across the street causes several people to quietly step away. Fear has started weaving itself into the fabric of everyday life. Historians believe that during the Black Death, communities often went through this exact stage, when people sensed something was terribly wrong, but still hoped the danger might pass quickly. Unfortunately, the plague rarely worked that way. Inside several houses across town, More people have developed the same terrifying symptoms: fever, weakness, and those strange swelling lumps. The local healer moves from house to house, carrying his leather bag of herbs and tools, but his visits are becoming more frequent than he can handle. He barely finishes examining one patient before another messenger arrives asking for help somewhere else. Meanwhile, the doctor with the bird-like mask has already left town, riding off toward another settlement where the sickness is spreading. He has too many places to visit, too many patients, and far too little knowledge about what's truly happening. By midday, the town council gathers near the church to discuss what should be done. A few officials sit around a rough wooden table, speaking in low voices while villagers watch from a distance. No one has dealt with something like this before, but they know one thing: the sickness seems to spread when people are close together. So the first solution feels obvious: close things down. The marketplace shortens its hours. Several taverns decide to shut their doors temporarily. Even the church services grow smaller as some families choose to stay home. It's an early attempt at something we would now call social distancing, though the people here would never use that phrase. They simply believe that fewer gatherings might slow the disease. Historians still debate how effective these early precautions were. In some towns, reducing contact may have slowed outbreaks slightly. In others, the plague spread so quickly that such measures barely made a difference. Back in the streets, though, life is already beginning to unravel. A cart passes slowly through town, carrying two bodies wrapped in cloth. The driver keeps his eyes forward, avoiding the stares of people standing in doorways. Funerals usually involve prayer, family gatherings, and careful burials. But now things are moving faster. Too fast. The churchyard cemetery, which once handled a steady but manageable number of burials, is beginning to fill up. The gravedigger works from early morning until evening, digging fresh holes beside older ones. And still, it's not enough. Church bells ring more frequently now, not just once a day, several times. Each slow toll echoes across the rooftops like a steady drumbeat, reminding everyone in town that the sickness is still spreading. There's also another strange change happening in the streets. The rats seem more active than usual. You notice them darting between barrels near the marketplace. One scurries across a wooden beam inside a barn. Another disappears beneath a pile of grain sacks in a storage shed. Again, no one thinks much about it. Rats have always been here, but historians studying plague outbreaks later noticed something fascinating. As rat populations began dying from infection, fleas often abandoned their dying hosts and sought new sources of blood. Humans, that's when the disease could explode through a community. And right now, that silent chain reaction may already be underway. Meanwhile, the emotional mood of the town continues shifting in subtle ways. Some families start avoiding their neighbors. Others whisper prayers more frequently. A few people claim the illness must be punishment from God. Medieval Europe was deeply religious, and when disaster struck, many believed they were signs of divine anger. So churches begin filling again, but this time not for normal services. People gather to pray for protection. Candles flicker against stone walls while villagers kneel silently, hoping faith alone might stop whatever force has arrived. One monk even claims he saw a strange sign in the sky the night before, a faint red glow near the horizon. Historians know medieval chroniclers often described unusual celestial events during times of crisis. Comets, eclipses, and atmospheric effects were sometimes interpreted as warnings from heaven. But whether the monk actually saw something or simply imagined it, the story spreads quickly. Fear loves mysterious explanations. And in times like this, people search desperately for meaning. As evening approaches, the streets grow quieter than usual. Families retreat indoors earlier than normal, bolting their doors and shuttering their windows. The tavern that normally fills with laughter and music at night remains dark. Even the dogs seem strangely subdued, curling up near doorways instead of wandering the streets. The town is slowly holding its breath, and somewhere inside several houses tonight, more people will begin feeling that familiar wave of heat creeping through their bodies. A fever starting, another swelling appearing, another family realizing something is terribly wrong. The sickness is no longer just visiting the town. It's settling in. And tomorrow, the changes will become even harder to ignore. Within a few more days, the sound of the church bells becomes something you can no longer ignore. At first they rang only once or twice each day, a slow and heavy toll that drifted across the rooftops. But now the bells ring so often that the sound blends into the background of daily life like a constant, mournful rhythm. Morning, midday, evening, sometimes in the middle of the night. Each time the bell swings, everyone in town knows what it means. Another death. You're walking near the churchyard when the bell begins again, its deep tone vibrating through the cool air. A small group of villagers pauses in the street, some lowering their heads quietly. No one asks who it is anymore. The list has grown too long. Historians estimate that during the worst years of the Black Death, between 1347 and 1351, Europe may have lost 25 to 50 million people, roughly a third of its population. Some towns and villages lost half their residents in just a few months, but statistics like that are impossible for the people here to imagine. All they know is that the cemetery is running out of space. You step through the wooden gate into the churchyard and immediately see the problem. Fresh piles of dirt line the edges of the graveyard where new holes have been dug. The gravedigger stands beside a shovel, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool weather. He's exhausted. There are simply too many burials. Funerals, once slow and respectful ceremonies, are becoming shorter and quieter. Families no longer gather in large groups to say goodbye. Instead, a few relatives stand at a distance while the priest murmurs quick prayers over the grave. Sometimes there isn't even time for that. In larger cities during the plague, workers eventually began digging mass graves, huge trenches where dozens of bodies could be buried together. Historians have discovered several of these pits in archaeological sites across Europe, filled with layers of skeletons placed side by side. In your town, things haven't reached that stage yet, but the gravedigger knows it might. Another cart rolls slowly through the gate carrying two bodies wrapped in simple cloth. The driver avoids eye contact with everyone nearby, focusing only on guiding the horse forward. The gravedigger sighs quietly. He already knows his afternoon just became longer. Outside the churchyard, the streets feel increasingly strange. Windows remain shuttered. Doors stay closed longer than usual. People walk quickly when they must leave home, keeping their distance from others. One of the most unsettling changes is how silent the marketplace has become. Where once dozens of merchants shouted prices and customers haggled loudly, now only a handful of stalls operate. The fish seller has stopped coming entirely. The butcher still opens his shop, but fewer customers appear each day. Food itself is becoming harder to move around town. Farmers hesitate to bring produce through crowded streets. Traders arriving from other regions sometimes turn around when they hear about the sickness here. Commerce, the heartbeat of any medieval town, is slowing down. Historians often point out that the Black Death didn't just cause illness. It disrupted entire economic systems. Trade routes faltered, markets closed, and labor shortages would eventually reshape society in surprising ways. But for now, the focus remains on survival. As the sun climbs higher, another grim task unfolds near the cemetery walls. The town council has ordered several laborers to begin digging a much larger trench just beyond the churchyard. Not individual graves, a long, wide pit. At first, the workers pretend not to understand why it's necessary. They swing their shovels into the dirt slowly, glancing nervously toward the town behind them. But deep down, everyone knows, if the deaths continue increasing, there won't be enough room in the cemetery. Mass burial may soon become unavoidable. The idea feels shocking to many villagers. Proper burial rituals are deeply important in medieval Christian culture. People believe the body should rest peacefully in consecrated ground, with prayers guiding the soul toward heaven. Mass graves feel wrong, disrespectful, but practicality has a way of overriding tradition during disasters. While the trench slowly grows deeper, another strange detail begins circulating through town. Some people claim the plague victims develop dark spots on their skin shortly before death. These marks sometimes appear purple or black, caused by bleeding beneath the skin as the infection spreads through the body. These spots are part of what later gave the pandemic its dramatic name, the Black Death. Interestingly, historians still debate whether medieval people actually used that exact term during the outbreak itself. Many records from the time simply called it the Great Mortality or the Pestilence. The phrase Black Death likely became common much later. Still, the dark marks themselves were very real and deeply frightening to anyone who saw them. By late afternoon, another cart approaches the cemetery. Then another. The gravedigger eventually stops trying to keep track of the names. He simply does his work. The church bell rings again just before sunset, its echo stretching across the quiet fields outside the town walls. Inside houses across the town, families sit around dim candlelight speaking in hushed voices. Some pray quietly. Others try to distract themselves with simple tasks, mending clothes, cleaning tools, preparing meals. But everyone is listening for the same sound. The bell, because every time it rings, it reminds them that the sickness is still moving through the town, one house at a time. And as darkness settles over the rooftops, the gravedigger continues working beneath the fading light, slowly widening the new trench that may soon hold far more than anyone wants to imagine. By now, the town has entered a strange new routine. Morning still comes. The sun still rises over the rooftops, spilling pale light across muddy streets and wooden buildings. But the life that once filled those streets feels thinner somehow, like a song playing at half volume. More houses are quiet now. More doors stay closed. And more people are beginning to ask the same uneasy question. If the sickness keeps spreading, how do you stop it? Since no one understands bacteria, fleas, or infected rats, the answers people come up with are creative. Some are harmless, some are bizarre, and a few are honestly a little dangerous. You hear about the first remedy while passing by a group of villagers gathered near a small herb stall. The woman who runs the stall is usually cheerful, but today she's speaking with great seriousness. She's selling bundles of strong-smelling plants. Lavender, rosemary, mint, thyme. The idea is simple. If bad air causes sickness, then breathing pleasant smells might protect you. So people begin carrying small cloth pouches filled with herbs, holding them close to their noses when walking through town. Some even hang the bundles from belts or wear them around their necks. Interestingly, historians know that this practice actually had a tiny accidental benefit. Certain herbs, especially ones like mint or lavender, can repel insects slightly. It wasn't enough to stop plague fleas entirely, but it may have reduced some bites without anyone realizing why. Of course, most remedies are far stranger. A rumor spreads that sitting beside a large fire filled with burning herbs will clean the air. Soon, several families begin lighting smoky fires inside their homes, filling rooms with thick, fragrant smoke. The houses smell wonderful. Unfortunately, the plague doesn't care. Another suggestion appears even more unusual. A wandering healer claims that rubbing crushed onions or garlic on the skin can draw sickness out of the body. People start experimenting with mixtures of garlic paste, herbs, and oil, applying them like protective ointments. Some villagers even begin carrying flowers constantly, pressing them against their noses whenever they walk past someone coughing. If you walk through town right now, you'd see people sniffing bouquets like detectives searching for clues. And then there are the truly strange cures. One medieval belief suggests that certain animals could somehow absorb illness from a person's body. That leads to a curious practice where live chickens are placed against swollen plague buboes, as if the bird might draw the sickness out. Historians still debate how widespread this practice actually was, but a few medical texts from the era mention similar ideas. Needless to say, the chickens probably did not solve the problem. Another remedy recommends bathing in vinegar or drinking herbal tonics made from various plants. Some people swallow bitter mixtures that promise to balance the humors. Because remember, most medieval medicine still revolves around the theory that illness is caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. So treatments often focus on restoring balance. That's why bloodletting remains popular. Doctors sometimes cut small veins to release blood, hoping it will remove the illness from the body. From a modern perspective, this treatment often made patients weaker rather than healthier. But at the time, it seemed logical. After all, doctors were working with the best knowledge available to them. Meanwhile, the emotional mood of the town continues changing in subtle ways. Some people become obsessed with trying every possible cure. Others begin to believe nothing will help at all. A blacksmith you pass in the street shakes his head when someone mentions another herbal remedy. God decides who lives, he mutters quietly. That belief is becoming more common. Medieval Europe is deeply religious, and many people believe disasters happen for spiritual reasons. If a plague has arrived, perhaps it means God is angry. So alongside herbal cures and strange treatments, another response begins spreading quickly through town. Prayer. The church fills again each evening, candles flickering along the stone walls while villagers kneel quietly. The priest leads long prayers asking for forgiveness, mercy, and protection. Some people confess sins they haven't mentioned in years, worried their souls might soon face judgment. Historians studying plague records often note how deeply faith shaped people's reactions to the disaster. In some places, religious devotion intensified dramatically during outbreaks, but not everyone agrees on what faith requires. A few villagers begin arguing that the town must have done something wrong to deserve this punishment. Maybe someone angered God. Maybe the community has become sinful. Those ideas plant the first small seeds of suspicion. Nothing serious yet, but when fear grows strong enough, people often start searching for someone to blame. For now, though, most villagers are still focused on trying to protect themselves. Herbs hang in doorways, smoke drifts from burning fires, garlic mixtures appear on doorsteps, and everywhere you walk, people carry small bundles of flowers like portable shields against invisible danger. Despite all these efforts, however, the church bell continues ringing. The cemetery trench grows deeper, and inside several homes tonight, more people will lie awake sweating with fever, wondering if the strange remedies scattered across the town might actually save them, or if the sickness has already chosen its next victims. By now, the town is living in a constant state of quiet tension. The church bells continue their slow, steady toll. The cemetery trench outside the walls has grown wider, and the once busy marketplace feels like a shadow of itself. But something else is beginning to change as well, something more emotional than physical. Fear. Fear has a strange way of moving through a community. At first it whispers softly in conversations and rumors. Then it grows louder, and eventually it starts looking for somewhere to land, someone to blame. You notice it one afternoon while walking past the well in the center of town. A small group of villagers stands there arguing in low voices. They stop speaking when you approach, but the tension in their faces is easy to see. One man insists the sickness arrived with foreign traders. Another claims it came from travelers passing through the region. Someone else says it must be caused by people practicing dark magic. None of these explanations are supported by evidence, of course. But in a world without modern science, people rely on whatever theories feel believable. And when something terrifying happens, simple explanations can feel very comforting. Historians studying the Black Death often point out that one of the darkest side effects of the plague wasn't just disease. It was the rise of suspicion and scapegoating. Communities under extreme stress sometimes began accusing certain groups of causing the sickness. Outsiders, travelers, minority communities, anyone who seemed different. In some parts of Europe, rumors spread that wells had been poisoned or that certain groups were secretly spreading the plague. These accusations led to violence in several regions. Historians still debate how widespread these events were, but records from the 1300s clearly show that fear sometimes turned into persecution. Thankfully, in your town the situation hasn't reached that point. Not yet, but the seeds of suspicion are there. You hear whispers about a traveling merchant who passed through a week ago. Someone claims he looked sick. Another person says his wagon smelled strange. A few villagers even suggest that strangers should no longer be allowed inside the town walls. The town council begins discussing stricter rules for travelers. Guards at the gate start asking more questions. Some visitors are turned away entirely. It's one of the earliest forms of what we would now call quarantine, though the word itself actually comes from the Italian term 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. In later plague outbreaks, ships arriving at certain ports were sometimes forced to wait 40 days before passengers could enter the city, just to make sure no one carried the disease. But in this small town, quarantine is still an improvised idea. People are simply trying whatever might help. At the same time, another emotional shift is happening inside many homes. Families are becoming cautious, even with each other. You pass by a small house where a woman stands outside the door speaking through a window to someone inside. Her husband, you overhear, developed a fever during the night. She doesn't want to risk bringing the sickness outside, so she stays in the yard, leaving food by the door and stepping back while he retrieves it. Scenes like this are becoming more common. Historians describe how plague outbreaks sometimes fractured normal social bonds. Friends stopped visiting. Neighbors avoided one another. Even family members occasionally kept their distance from the sick, not because they lacked compassion, but because they were terrified. One Italian writer from the 14th century, Giovanni Boccaccio, famously described how fear during the plague sometimes caused people to abandon even close relatives. Historians still argue about whether his description exaggerated the situation, but many accounts confirm that the fear of infection could change human behavior in dramatic ways. In your town, most people are still trying to care for their families as best they can, but you can sense the strain building. The streets grow quieter each day. Fewer children play outside. Even the dogs seem restless, wandering through empty alleys looking for scraps. Another strange detail begins circulating through town as well. Some people claim that certain houses are cursed. Whenever someone inside one of those houses falls ill, neighbors become nervous about walking too close to the building. A few families even hang symbols or charms near their doors, hoping to ward off bad spirits. Medieval superstition is a powerful force. Without clear scientific explanations, people fill the gaps with folklore, religious ideas, and imagination. Meanwhile, the practical reality of the plague continues unfolding. More patients appear, more carts travel quietly toward the cemetery, and the trench outside the town walls grows deeper still. By late evening, you walk past the marketplace again and notice something eerie. The entire square is nearly empty. Only one lantern burns near the well. A cat slips silently between barrels searching for food. And somewhere in the distance, the church bell begins ringing again. Slow, heavy, unavoidable. People listening inside their homes pause for a moment as the sound drifts through the streets. Another neighbor gone, another family grieving. The sickness shows no signs of slowing. And as fear continues spreading through the town, sometimes even faster than the disease itself, you begin to realize something unsettling. The plague isn't just attacking bodies. It's slowly unraveling the trust that once held the community together. Not long after the fear begins spreading through town, the council decides something must be done to slow the sickness. Up until now, people have mostly relied on prayers, strange remedies, and cautious behavior. But as more houses report fevers and swelling, the leaders of the town realize the illness might continue spreading unless they take stronger action. So one evening, just before sunset, a small group of officials walks through the streets making a quiet announcement. If someone inside a house becomes sick with the plague, the entire house will be sealed. No one goes in. No one comes out. At first, the idea sounds shocking, but in the minds of the council, it makes sense. If the disease spreads through contact with the sick, then isolating them might protect the rest of the town. Historians studying medieval outbreaks recognize this as one of the earliest forms of plague quarantine. Cities across Europe eventually adopted similar strategies, sometimes marking infected houses or placing guards outside their doors. But for the families inside those houses, the experience could be terrifying. You see it happen for the first time just 2 days later. A small house near the edge of town has reported a sick resident, a tailor who developed a fever during the night. By morning, the familiar swelling appeared under his arm. The town council sends 2 guards. They arrive quietly but firmly. One of them carries wooden boards and nails. The other brings a bucket of red paint. Villagers watch from their windows as the guards approach the door. The tailor's wife stands in the doorway, clearly frightened, trying to explain that her husband might recover. But the decision has already been made. The guards place a wooden plank across the door and nail it to the frame. Then they paint a large symbol on the wood, a crude red mark warning others that sickness lives inside. The message is simple: stay away. Inside the house now live the tailor, his wife, and their 2 children, all of them sealed inside together. In theory, the rule is meant to protect the rest of the town. If the disease cannot escape the house, perhaps the outbreak will slow down. But historians still debate how effective these early quarantines really were. In many cases, fleas carrying plague bacteria could easily travel through cracks in walls or jump onto animals moving between buildings. So while the quarantine might stop people from spreading the disease, it doesn't always stop the fleas. Meanwhile, inside the sealed house, life becomes a quiet struggle. Food must be delivered from outside. Neighbors leave small baskets near the door and step away quickly before someone inside retrieves them through a narrow opening. Conversations happen through windows, sometimes through walls. The children inside grow restless. Staring out the shutters at empty streets, they are no longer allowed to walk. And the worst part, of course, is the waiting, because no one knows what will happen next. Some plague victims recover after several painful days. Others grow weaker until they can barely move. In the most severe cases, death can arrive quickly. Inside that sealed house, every cough and every groan becomes frightening. Outside, the rest of the town walks past quietly, pretending not to look. You notice how people cross the street to avoid walking too close to the marked door. Even the guards standing nearby keep their distance whenever possible. It's a strange situation. Everyone understands the quarantine is meant to protect the town, but it also feels a little like abandoning the people inside. Historians reading medieval diaries often find heartbreaking descriptions of this exact dilemma. Communities had to choose between compassion and survival. Sometimes neighbors continued bringing food and water to quarantined homes. Other times, fear caused people to stay far away. In your town, most villagers still try to help where they can. Every morning, someone leaves bread outside the tailor's door. Another neighbor places a small jug of water near the step. No one stays long enough to speak, but the gesture matters. As the days pass, the house remains sealed. At night, you occasionally hear quiet crying drifting from the windows. The church bell rings several more times across the town, reminding everyone that the sickness continues claiming victims elsewhere. And then, after nearly a week, something unexpected happens. One morning, the door of the quarantine house opens slightly. The tailor's wife steps outside. Slowly, carefully, she looks pale and exhausted but alive. Behind her, the children appear in the doorway, peeking cautiously into the sunlight. The tailor himself remains weak but recovering. Against the odds, their family survived. The guards remove the wooden plank from the door, and the red symbol fades slowly under fresh rain over the following days. For a brief moment, the town feels a small spark of hope. If some people can recover, maybe the sickness won't take everyone. But even as that hope spreads quietly through conversations, more houses across town are beginning to show the same warning marks on their doors. And each new red symbol reminds everyone that survival during the plague is often a matter of luck as much as anything else. As the days pass, the town begins to feel quieter than you ever thought possible. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm evening or a lazy Sunday afternoon, but a deeper kind of silence. The kind that settles over streets when too many people have disappeared from them. You notice it most clearly one morning while walking toward the marketplace. Normally, children would already be running through the alleys by now, laughing, shouting, chasing each other around carts and barrels, while adults tried unsuccessfully to keep them out of trouble. But today, there are only a few, and even they move more slowly. Some stand alone near doorways, watching the empty street as if unsure what to do next. The plague has changed family life in ways no one expected. Many adults are sick. Others are busy caring for sick relatives. And in some heartbreaking cases, parents have simply vanished from their homes entirely, taken by the disease within a few days. When that happens, children are sometimes left behind with older relatives, sometimes with neighbors, and occasionally with no one at all. Historians studying the Black Death often mention how the pandemic created large numbers of orphans across Europe. With death arriving so quickly, families sometimes had no time to arrange proper care for children before tragedy struck. In large cities, records show that churches and charitable groups struggled to take in the growing number of young survivors. But in smaller towns like this one, the situation is less organized. You pass a small boy sitting on the steps of a house, his arms wrapped around his knees. The door behind him is closed and quiet. A woman from across the street eventually walks over and hands him a piece of bread. She doesn't say much. She simply leaves the food beside him and returns to her house. It's a small act of kindness in a town that's slowly learning how fragile life can be. Meanwhile, many homes remain locked and shuttered. The red quarantine symbols appear on more doors now. Each one marks a family currently fighting the sickness inside. And when a house grows completely silent, everyone nearby understands what it probably means. The streets themselves begin to change too. Without as many people moving around, animals start wandering more freely. Chickens peck at the ground in the middle of empty lanes. A stray dog trots confidently through the marketplace, sniffing abandoned stalls. Even the rats seem bolder than before. You see one sitting on a wooden crate near the well, calmly chewing something it found in the dirt. Normally, the constant movement of people would scare it away. Now it barely notices you. Historians believe these quieter streets may have actually helped rats and fleas spread more easily through certain areas. With fewer people cleaning or disturbing the environment, rodents sometimes had even more freedom to roam. Of course, no one in town realizes that connection. They're far too focused on the visible changes happening all around them. The church bell still rings frequently, though now the sound feels almost distant, as if people are becoming numb to it. Grief is a heavy emotion, but when it happens over and over again, the mind sometimes builds quiet defenses just to keep going. So daily life continues in small ways. A few shops remain open. Farmers still bring vegetables from nearby fields. The blacksmith still hammers metal in his workshop, though fewer customers visit. But everything happens more slowly, more cautiously. One afternoon you walk past the town schoolhouse and notice its door standing open. The teacher sits alone at his desk, staring at a few scattered papers. Normally, the room would be filled with children practicing letters or reciting prayers. Today, the benches are empty. Too many families are staying home, and some children simply won't be coming back. Historians sometimes describe the Black Death not only as a health disaster, but also as a social disruption. Schools closed, markets slowed, and normal routines across Europe were interrupted for months or even years. Entire generations grew up during this strange pause in everyday life. As evening approaches, the town settles into another quiet night. A few candles glow behind shuttered windows. Smoke drifts from chimneys where families prepare simple meals. Somewhere in the distance, someone softly sings a prayer, but the streets remain mostly empty. You pass by the marketplace one last time before heading home, and for a moment you stop to take in the silence. The wind moves gently between buildings. A loose shutter creaks softly against its hinges, and for the first time since the sickness began spreading, the church bell does not ring. Not tonight. Just for a moment the town rests, but everyone knows the quiet will not last forever. Somewhere behind one of those closed doors, another fever may already be rising. Another family may already be waiting through the long night, hoping the sickness will pass them by. And by morning, the fragile calm covering the town might once again be broken. As the weeks pass, something new begins happening around the edges of town. At first, you only notice it as a small detail. A horse saddled earlier than usual. A wagon quietly loaded before sunrise. A family slipping through the town, gate carrying bundles of clothing and food. People are leaving. Not everyone, of course. Most villagers simply don't have the option. Farmers must tend their fields, craftsmen rely on their workshops, and many families lack the money or horses needed for travel. But the wealthier households, the merchants, landowners, and a few minor nobles who live in larger homes near the town center, have started making a different choice. They're heading for the countryside. The idea is simple. If the sickness spreads in crowded places, then open land might be safer. Fresh air, fewer people, less chance of catching whatever disease is moving through the town. Historically, this wasn't an unusual reaction. During the Black Death, many wealthy families across Europe attempted to escape cities and towns for rural estates or distant villages. One famous example comes from the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who described groups of young nobles leaving plague-stricken Florence to hide in country villas. His collection of stories, the Decameron, is set during this exact scenario. Historians still debate how accurate his description was, but the general idea reflects something real. Those with resources often tried to flee. Of course, escaping the plague was not always easy. Sometimes travelers unknowingly carried the disease with them. But in the minds of the families preparing to leave your town, the countryside feels like their best chance. One morning, you see the merchant who once sold imported spices packing his wagon carefully. Crates of cloth and jars of dried goods are stacked neatly beside sacks of grain. His wife stands nearby, holding their young daughter's hand. The child looks confused, glancing back at the house she's about to leave behind. Neighbors watch quietly from their windows. Some feel jealous, others feel angry, and a few simply feel abandoned. Because while the wealthy prepare to leave, most people must stay exactly where they are. The blacksmith cannot move his forge. The baker cannot abandon his ovens. Farmers still need to harvest crops growing outside the town walls. Life continues, even in the middle of disaster. Historians often note that the Black Death exposed deep social divisions in medieval society. Wealth and status sometimes allowed people to escape danger more easily, while poorer communities had far fewer options. But even the wealthy travelers leaving town today cannot truly escape uncertainty. Roads across the region are filled with rumors. Some villages refuse to allow outsiders inside their walls. Other towns have already been hit by the same sickness. Travelers sometimes arrive at closed gates, with guards shouting down from towers telling them to turn around. Fear spreads quickly between communities. Back in your town, though, the departures leave behind a strange emptiness. The large merchant house near the square now sits quiet, its windows boarded. A noble family's estate near the church stands locked and silent, their servants dismissed or left behind to manage what remains. And each empty house adds to the growing sense that the town itself is slowly shrinking. Meanwhile, the sickness continues moving through the remaining population. The church bell rings again the following afternoon, and again that evening. Yet something interesting begins happening alongside all the tragedy. Because with so many people gone, either dead or fled, the balance of everyday life starts shifting in subtle ways. A farmer complains that he cannot find enough workers to help harvest grain. The blacksmith receives more repair requests than he can handle. Even the gravedigger quietly mentions he might need an assistant. Historians studying the aftermath of the Black Death often highlight this unexpected consequence. Labor suddenly became far more valuable, with fewer workers available. Surviving laborers sometimes gained better wages, improved working conditions, or new opportunities. But that change will take time. Right now, the town is still deep in the middle of the crisis, and as evening settles across the rooftops once again, another wagon slowly rolls through the gate, not leaving this time. Arriving, a tired traveler steps down beside his horse, looking around cautiously at the half-empty streets. He has come searching for work, because even during one of the darkest disasters in history, life doesn't completely stop. It shifts, it adapts, and the people who remain must learn how to survive in a world that suddenly feels very different from the one they knew just a few months ago. One afternoon, while the town sits in its usual uneasy quiet, something unusual appears on the road leading toward the gate. At first it looks like a small procession, just a few distant figures walking slowly through the dust. But as they draw closer, you realize there are many more of them than you first thought. Dozens, perhaps. They move in a long line, dressed in simple robes or rough clothing. Some carry wooden crosses. Others hold candles or banners marked with religious symbols. But what truly catches everyone's attention is what they're doing. As they walk, several of them begin striking their own backs with short leather whips. Again and again, the snapping sound echoes across the quiet road. Villagers standing near the gate exchange uneasy glances. These travelers are flagellants. During the years of the Black Death, groups like this appeared across parts of Europe. They believed the plague was a punishment from God, sent to cleanse humanity for its sins. And if God was angry, then perhaps people needed to show repentance. Publicly, dramatically, so these groups marched from town to town performing rituals of self-punishment. They would gather in town squares, pray loudly, sing hymns, and whip themselves across the back as a sign of sorrow and humility. The idea was that suffering might convince God to forgive humanity and stop the plague. Historians still debate exactly how large the flagellant movement became. Some records suggest thousands of people joined these traveling groups during the height of the pandemic, but church leaders were often uneasy about them, partly because the rituals could become intense, and partly because these groups sometimes operated outside the authority of local priests. Still, when the procession reaches your town gate, the guards hesitate. They look tired. Everyone looks tired these days, and perhaps a few prayers couldn't hurt. So the gates open. The group walks slowly into the town square. Villagers gather along the edges of the marketplace to watch. Some look curious. Others appear uncomfortable. A tall man leading the procession raises a wooden cross high into the air. His voice carries across the quiet square as he begins speaking about repentance, forgiveness, and divine mercy. Then the ritual begins. The flagellants kneel in a circle on the ground. They remove their outer robes, revealing shirts stained with dust and sweat. Each person lifts a whip made of leather cords, sometimes with small knots tied into the ends, and together they begin striking their own backs. Not violently but firmly, rhythmically. The snapping sound echoes across the empty stalls of the marketplace. Some villagers watch in silence. Others kneel beside them in prayer. A few people quietly slip away, uncomfortable with the scene. It's a strange moment, part religious ceremony, part public performance, and part desperate attempt to bargain with forces no one truly understands. Historians studying these events often note that the flagellant movement spread rapidly during the early years of the plague, especially in parts of Germany and Central Europe. Groups would stay in a town for a day or two, perform their rituals, and then continue traveling to the next settlement. Sometimes crowds welcomed them. Other times, authorities tried to drive them away. In your town, the reaction is mixed. The priest watches from the church doorway with a worried expression. He understands the desire for repentance, but he also knows that religious rituals outside church authority can become unpredictable. Meanwhile, some villagers seem strangely comforted by the ceremony. At least someone is doing something. After weeks of fear and uncertainty, action, even painful action, can feel better than helpless waiting. As evening approaches, the flagellants finish their prayers. The leader thanks the townspeople and encourages everyone to repent of their sins, show kindness to neighbors, and trust in God's mercy. Then the group gathers their belongings and prepares to leave. Just like that, they walk out of the gate and disappear down the road toward the next town. The square slowly empties again. Stalls remain closed. The wind moves softly through hanging signs and empty carts. For a brief moment, the town feels almost normal again. But historians looking back at the Black Death often point out something fascinating. Movements like the flagellants showed just how desperately people searched for meaning during the disaster. Without scientific explanations, spiritual interpretations filled the gap. And sometimes those interpretations led people down strange and dramatic paths. As night falls, the familiar quiet settles over the streets once more. Candles glow faintly behind wooden shutters. A dog barks somewhere near the town wall, and in the distance, you hear the church bell again. Slow, heavy, another reminder that even after the prayers, the rituals, and the long march of the flagellants, The plague has not yet finished with this town. As the weeks stretch into months, the landscape around the town begins to change in ways no one would have expected at the start of the year. At first, the changes are subtle. A farmhouse outside the town wall sits unusually quiet for several days. The chimney no longer sends up smoke in the morning. The fields nearby remain unworked, the crops bending gently in the wind with no farmer walking between the rows. Then someone finally rides out to check. The house is empty, or nearly empty. What happened inside isn't discussed in detail when the rider returns, but the message spreads quickly enough through town. The entire family who lived there is gone. Not long after that, another farm falls silent, and then another. Historians studying the Black Death often describe how entire villages in some regions simply disappeared. Records from parts of England, France, and Italy show small settlements that were completely abandoned after losing most, or all, of their population. These places later became known as lost villages or deserted settlements. Archaeologists have even found the outlines of these vanished communities centuries later: stone foundations, old wells, and faint traces of roads leading to houses that no longer exist. Standing outside your town now, you begin to see how something like that could happen. The plague doesn't move in neat patterns. It strikes one house, then another. Sometimes it spreads slowly. Other times it moves with frightening speed. And when too many people disappear from a small community, everyday life simply stops functioning. Fields go unplanted, animals wander away, buildings collapse slowly from neglect. One afternoon you walk along the road just outside the town walls and notice an abandoned cottage half hidden by tall grass. The door hangs crookedly from its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. A few chickens wander freely in the yard. No one seems to claim them. Inside the house, the hearth is cold. Dust has already begun settling over the wooden table where someone once ate dinner only weeks ago. It's eerie how quickly a place can feel forgotten. Historians still argue about the exact number of villages that disappeared during the Black Death, but in some regions the losses were staggering. Entire maps had to be redrawn after the plague because so many communities simply vanished from the landscape. Back in your town, though, enough people remain for life to continue, just barely. Farmers who survived the sickness now find themselves responsible for larger fields than before. With fewer neighbors to share the work, some land simply goes untended. You see patches of farmland slowly turning wild again, grass growing where wheat once stood. And yet, strangely, the survivors begin noticing something else. There are opportunities now that didn't exist before. The blacksmith, who once competed with several other craftsmen in nearby villages, now receives requests from miles around. Farmers bring broken tools, wagon wheels, and plow parts because fewer smiths remain to repair them. A young farmhand who once struggled to find steady work suddenly receives multiple offers from landowners desperate for labor. Historians studying the long-term impact of the Black Death often point to this shift as one of the pandemic's most surprising consequences. With millions of people gone, workers became far more valuable, wages began rising, landowners competed for labor, and the rigid social structure of medieval Europe slowly started to loosen. But these changes happened gradually, almost invisibly at first. Right now, most people are still focused on the immediate struggle to survive. The church bell continues ringing, though not quite as often as before. Some houses reopen their shutters after weeks of darkness. A few children cautiously return to playing in the streets again. Life, fragile as it is, begins trying to rebuild itself, yet the scars of the plague remain everywhere. Empty houses, abandoned farms, fields slowly turning back into wilderness. Even the roads feel quieter than they once did. Travelers passing through the region often comment on the strange emptiness of the countryside. Inns that once bustled with merchants now sit half full. Entire stretches of farmland lie unused. One historian later wrote that parts of Europe after the plague felt like a world where too much land existed and not enough people remained to fill it. As evening settles once more over your town, the setting sun casts long shadows across those silent fields beyond the walls, fields that once fed dozens of families, fields that now wait patiently for whoever might come next, because history has a way of moving forward, even after enormous loss, and the survivors, however few they may be, will soon begin shaping a very different world from the one that existed before the plague arrived. As the seasons slowly change, something subtle begins shifting in the town. Not the sickness itself, not yet, The plague still appears from time to time, slipping quietly into homes where a fever begins in the night. But the pace of death, which once felt unstoppable, begins to slow just slightly. The church bell rings less often. Some weeks pass with only one or two funerals. For the first time in months, people begin to notice the quiet spaces between the tolls. Historians studying the Black Death believe many communities experience this gradual easing. After devastating waves of infection, the disease sometimes burned through so many potential hosts that it simply began running out of people to infect. It wasn't truly gone, but its grip loosened, and as the fear slowly lifts, life in the town begins reorganizing itself in surprising ways. You notice it first in the marketplace. More stalls are opening again. The baker's shop, closed for weeks after the death of his apprentice, finally unlocks its doors one cool morning. The smell of fresh bread drifts into the street again, and several villagers gather quietly outside, waiting for their turn. The baker himself looks older somehow. Everyone does, but he still needs the dough with steady hands. Across the square, the blacksmith's forge burns brighter than ever. With so many tools broken or neglected during the worst months of the plague, farmers and travelers now line up outside his workshop. He works from dawn until sunset repairing plows, sharpening blades and fixing wagon wheels. And he's charging more than he used to. Surprisingly, people pay without much argument, because there simply aren't as many blacksmiths left. This is one of the strange economic shifts historians often talk about when discussing the aftermath of the Black Death. With such a massive loss of population, labor suddenly becomes scarce. Farmers who once struggled to find steady work now discover landowners offering higher wages. Craftsmen who once competed fiercely for customers now receive more requests than they can handle. Even servants, who previously had little bargaining power, sometimes begin asking for better conditions. In parts of Europe, this shift caused serious tension between workers and wealthy landowners. Some rulers even tried passing laws to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, attempting to stop laborers from demanding higher pay. Historians still debate how effective those laws were, but many agree that the pandemic helped weaken the rigid social hierarchies that had dominated medieval life for centuries. Back in your town, though, the changes feel quieter. A farmer hires 2 new workers from a nearby region because he can't manage all his land alone anymore. A widow who once depended on charity now runs a small herb stall in the marketplace, earning enough to support herself. Even the young traveler who arrived months ago searching for work now owns a small wagon and delivers goods between nearby villages. Little by little, the town is rebuilding itself, but the memory of the plague remains everywhere. Empty houses still line certain streets. The large burial trench outside the cemetery has been carefully covered with soil and marked with a simple wooden cross, and many families still speak in hushed voices when remembering the friends and relatives they lost. Historians often describe the Black Death not just as a health disaster, but as a turning point in European history. The massive population loss reshaped economies, changed labor systems, and even influenced cultural attitudes toward life and death. Art from the period began reflecting darker themes. Stories spoke more openly about mortality. People seemed more aware than ever that life could change suddenly. Walking through town now, you can feel that awareness lingering in the air. The children playing near the well laugh just as loudly as before, but their parents watch them more carefully. Neighbors greet each other warmly, but with a quiet understanding that they survived something enormous together. And in the evenings, when the wind moves gently through the streets, the town almost feels peaceful again. Not the same as before, but calmer. The plague has not completely disappeared from the world. It will return in waves over the coming centuries. But this particular storm seems to be fading. The survivors step slowly back into their routines. Markets reopen. Fields are planted again. Doors once sealed with quarantine marks now stand open to the sunlight. History, as it always does, continues moving forward, and the people who remain will carry the memory of this strange and terrifying time for the rest of their lives. By the time another season rolls in, the town looks almost familiar again. Almost the same narrow streets wind between wooden houses. The same church tower rises above the rooftops. Smoke drifts from chimneys in the early morning air, and the smell of bread once again floats through the marketplace. But if you look closely, you can see that the town is not quite the same place it was before the sickness arrived. There are gaps now, houses that stand empty, workshops that never reopened, fields that no one claimed after the families who farmed them were lost to the plague. The changes are quiet, but they are everywhere. Historians believe the Black Death reduced Europe's population by somewhere between 30 and 50% in just a few years. Imagine half the people you know suddenly gone: neighbors, friends, merchants, farmers, children. That kind of loss doesn't simply fade away. It reshapes the world. You walk through the marketplace one afternoon and notice a new stall set up near the well. A young woman sells herbs and dried flowers from small wooden baskets. Months ago, she had been helping her parents run a nearby farm. Now the farm is gone, but she found another way to survive. Across the square, the blacksmith still works tirelessly at his forge, sparks jumping into the air each time his hammer strikes glowing metal. With fewer craftsmen left in the region, his skills have become more valuable than ever. Farmers now travel from distant villages to repair tools or buy new ones. Life continues adapting, and slowly, the town begins filling the empty spaces left behind. Travelers arrive searching for work. Families from nearby villages move into abandoned homes. Children who survived the plague grow older, stepping into roles their parents once held. The world doesn't stay empty forever, but the memory of what happened remains very real. You see it in the way people talk about the past now. Before the plague, life was often taken for granted. Harvest seasons came and went, markets bustled, and towns grew slowly year after year. Now everyone understands something different. Life is fragile. Even the church sermons sound slightly different than they once did. Priests speak more often about compassion, kindness, and the unpredictability of fate. Historians studying medieval writings after the Black Death noticed a shift in tone across Europe. Art and literature began reflecting deeper thoughts about mortality and the meaning of life. The plague had forced people to confront death on a scale few had ever imagined, and that experience changed how many of them saw the world. There's also another fascinating historical debate that scholars still discuss today. Some historians believe the Black Death helped push Europe toward major social transformations, eventually contributing to the end of rigid feudal systems and the beginning of new economic structures. Others argue the changes were slower and more complicated than that, but nearly everyone agrees on one thing. The pandemic marked a turning point. It shook medieval society in ways that echoed for centuries afterward. As evening settles over the town once again, you walk along the edge of the fields beyond the walls. The sun sinks slowly toward the horizon, casting long golden light across the farmland. Some fields are newly planted again. Others remain wild and overgrown. Nature has been quietly reclaiming pieces of the land, while people struggle to rebuild. A gentle breeze moves through tall grass, carrying the faint sound of laughter from children playing near the town gate. That sound feels important somehow, because despite everything that happened, the fear, the sickness, the endless toll of the church bell, life has found its way back here. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough for new stories to begin. As the evening grows quieter, you find a peaceful place to sit and rest for a moment. The town behind you glows softly with lantern light, and the fields stretch endlessly under the fatting sky. The world feels slower now, softer. The wind moves gently through the grass, almost like a whisper passing through the land. And if you listen closely, you can imagine all the lives that once filled this place. The farmers walking through their crops, the merchants calling out in the marketplace, the children racing down narrow streets on warm summer afternoons. History leaves echoes behind, some loud, some quiet. The story of the plague is one of those echoes, dark and difficult, but also deeply human, because even in the face of something as overwhelming as the Black Death, people still found ways to care for each other, rebuild their homes, and continue living. And now, As the night settles gently over the rooftops and fields, the town rests once more beneath the stars. The bells are quiet, the streets are calm, and the long, difficult chapter of the plague slowly fades into the past, like a distant memory carried away on the evening breeze. End of script. Sweet dreams.